Welcome to Apple Carnegie Library. My name's Kiara Young. This is how you sign my name. We are so excited to have this amazing opportunity today in partnership with Apple TV Plus. I would like you all, I know you've come here to have our conversation today and view some clips for the newly released Deaf President Now documentary with director and producer Nyle DiMarco. We'll be here, and I want you all, as you're waiting, think about some questions you might want to ask as you watch the clips. And think about any questions you might have. We also have, from Gallaudet University, Bobby Cordano, who will moderate and ask questions. Once they're done, we will have the unique opportunity with both Bobby Cordano.
What a great introduction. Oh, and Kiara, before you leave.
Yes?
I don't know that we mentioned that Kiara is a graduate of Gallaudet. We're so proud of her work and leadership here at the store. Thank you for all you do in representing Gallaudet so well. It definitely means a lot.
Thank you so much.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's so exciting to be able to work with Apple.
There's a firestorm vicinity of Gallaudet University.
The world's only deaf university. The time was now.
He is the producer and director of this film, and I am thrilled that he is here to talk with us a bit about the experience making the film and give you some time at the end to ask questions you might have. So with that, I'd like to introduce Nyle DiMarco and a few things you might want to know about him. First, I should tell you that he is a graduate of Gallaudet University back in 2012. He went on to become the very first deaf person, the first person rather, to win 2 reality TV shows. You may remember him in America's Next Top Model and Dancing with the Stars. So he holds this record on his own, historic record, in fact, in American television. He's also written a book called Deaf Utopia. If you read the book that he's written, you'll get a glimpse into understanding a little bit about this film at the same time. This film provides a more in-depth understanding of Nyle, who he is, and some of his thinking. He was also the first deaf person, he is the first deaf person to produce and direct a major film of this kind that's been distributed by a major distributing company, Apple, and we are honored to have him here with us today to share a little bit about his story making this film. So Nyle, please join us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
You know, every time I watch it, I feel that sense of inspiration. I just so appreciate it. I think people would appreciate hearing your story and why you chose to make this film and share this story now. There are so many other different stories you could tell based on story. Why now?
So growing up, this was a story of my life. It's part of the deaf community and my deaf family. Going to the school for the deaf and the history of the deaf community, this gets repeated many, many times. I remember in the 5th grade, I went to a mainstream school, so with a bunch of hearing students, and I expected everybody to know my history, because by that age, I thought, we should be aware of these civil rights movement activities that took place and, that have had such an impact on our country, and none of them had heard of Deaf President Now at all. And so people ask me, when did you realize that you were really deaf and stuff like that? And I think that was a moment where I realized I'm deaf and other people don't know my history and my story being a deaf person. And so it was always in the back of my mind how important this was, and I was very fortunate to be able to, go to work in the entertainment industry, and the Deaf President Now was the first major project I really wanted to undertake to make sure that this is part of the entire civil rights movement history, that it's learned about in schools, and it's not just for us. It's not just for the deaf kids, and there's a lot less deaf kids in the educational system who are learning this story, but it's so critical. It's so important for them to understand, and it's so important to know how this fight for our
Myself, find my curiosity here, realizing that I identify so much with people in the movie who are deaf, being deaf myself. And so when you were making this movie, you know, experiencing all that you had before, during, and after, what are the same?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess definitely, I'm very proud to be deaf, as you know. I'm culturally deaf. I've used sign language since I was born. But to be able to produce this story and then share it out with the world, for me, it's very powerful. You know, to realize that I can't have an important job in what I do, and I want our community to experience.
I just wanted to share here the next question related to the film. I know that the movie has different themes that are very important to the storyline. I'm curious to know, with those themes, why are they there? Can you tell us a little bit about those themes? We'll be showing some clips and talking a little bit more in depth about them, but how did you come up with these themes? Why did...
So the Deaf President Now movement did not just happen overnight, actually. It took a lot of coordination. There were a lot of generational experiences that played into the oppression that was felt at this time. And I know that because I come from a deaf family. My parents are deaf. My grandparents and great-grandparents are all deaf for many generations. And they all had different experiences. Every generation, the previous generation had a little bit worse with the oppression. A little bit of the more oppression of using sign language in the community even. And the Deaf President Now movement with these 4 student leaders, they became people I could look up to. They were from my parents' generation, and that experience that was passed down to me, and also through understanding my family's generational self-advocacy that had taken place, to understand that change is possible.
As a deaf person, what they see is people who come from generations of deaf people as being elitist. And I don't think that's so much the challenge, but it's the natural language skills that they've developed from birth that allow them to come together collectively, and they've grown up within the deaf community with those experiences. I really believe this is the first time that I've seen a film, and maybe even any kind of a book that's been written, that describes the power of that kind of an experience. I can relate with that because I think about my grandparents and my parents, how they opened the doors little by little, incrementally, to get to the point where I can be here, this generation, and you see that reflected very powerfully in the film. What other?
The other themes are showing how the people who aren't familiar with deaf people, you know, view deaf people as the playground of deafness that they had out there with Zinser and Spillman, where they were working with us at Gallaudet, even though they didn't have an understanding of the community. They didn't know them, but they were just passing by. We were just a playground for them to stop through and be a playground for them to interact with a community. We're not a playground.
And I look forward to talking about each of the clips and talking about your perspectives and why the clips are being shown today. It's so much nicer to have watching the film with those insights from the director readily available. We don't often get that experience, so thank you for that. And with that, if you're ready, let's go to the first clip.
In favor of a woman who can't hear.
I refuse to accept this.
To this being a sense of outrage, as some people have referred to it. As you see this, what's the importance of having this clip here, and what insights would you want to share related to that?
Well, when Jerry said that he refuses to accept this, again, it's because of what he'd seen from the story of his father, a deaf man who was the best deaf crown builder for the dental lab where he worked, but he was put in the basement at work because his company where he worked didn't want to have a deaf person being seen in the workplace. And so that strongly relates to that moment of what Jerry is saying, where enough is enough. Deaf people can lead, deaf people should be seen. There's a lot more to that story where Jerry was the one who started out leading the rallies, actually, long before DPN ever happened, almost 8 months before, Jerry was talking to people, and at the time, and deaf people said, well, no, I don't think a deaf person could be the president of Gallaudet University because, you know, how would they work with Congress, or how would they speak to the people on the Hill? And so Jerry really actually laid the groundwork for when this protest took place.
Of the community. We know events don't happen overnight. To effectively deliver a message, you have to build a sense of consensus. That has to take place first. And then the second part that strikes me is just the ability to say no, and the power behind that no, getting people to understand that they have the opportunity to say no, and that's what starts the whole thing off. So you talked about Jerry and all the groundwork that was laid and getting to the moment of that announcement. And I'd like to ask you now, being in the role of a student body government and emerged as the leader in that moment, people may not realize how that role plays a key aspect, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the student body government does have student leadership to represent them, you know, physically in Gallaudet University for things. So, I mean, they do become the spokesperson for the students. And Greg was elected as the student body government president and sworn in just 1 week before this event. So he wasn't fully prepared for the protest that was going to take place. Where you think about Jerry was he'd been preparing for protests for 8 months, you know, so when he need for a spokesperson to lead the week, it came down between the two of them. Greg as the student body president and Jerry. But ultimately, Greg was chosen because he had been sworn in as the student body president. But Jerry he was upset by that because he had been leading this movement up until this point of the protests. So, you know, the universe works in mysterious ways, I think. It's just how the universe wants.
And what I find fascinating is the role of electing a person by the Gallaudet community, as the students did elect Greg to that position. To be in that former role, often, you know, you have to manage with the roles that are.
So Davis, the co-director, and I, we were trying to figure out how to make this movie.
Oh, and by the way, people may not know who Davis is. Do you want to tell them a little bit about him?
Yeah, Davis Guggenheim, he's an amazing director. He's the co-director of this. He's been working in the film industry for 30 years, and I was so blessed that he wanted to work with me and pull me in as a co-director on this and work together. So he and I talked about how to create the story and how to create the movie, because it's not a simple story. There's a lot of complexity to it, and how we could maybe simplify it into a film. And one of the things I told him while we were making this documentary, I said, look, I want it to be the opportunity for deaf people to have an immersive experience in a film. And I also want people to leave, the deaf people to leave saying, this is our story. Because too many times growing up, there are movies that have deaf people in them, and TV shows with deaf characters and storylines with deaf people. But it's very obvious that it was made by hearing people. Just how it's written, how they present it, the dialogue, the camera angles. I wanted to make something different, and I really wanted to bring that deaf point of view, where we forced hearing people to experience the deaf experience as much as possible. But not just that, but that everyday experience that we have as a deaf person, where somebody comes and bangs on Jerry's door. Some deaf people can't hear it, but we feel those vibrations. We see it. How do we represent that in this film? How do we show the lighting? How do we to accurately represent what the fire alarm pulling really meant for this movement?
Two leaders as well, how they emerged as leaders and were a part of all of this. But before we go to the next clip, I wanted you to talk about the deaf perspective that you brought to this film. This is probably one of the first times we've experienced that deaf point of view throughout the entire film. And I think a big part of that is because it's just such a deaf-centered story. So what were you able to bring to this experience of telling? So is this really the first time that we've had this many deaf people involved in the production, distribution of it?
I don't know that we have records, but we had over 40 deaf people working on set.
Yeah, I'm glad you have record here of having 40 different people involved. So students
yes.
doing research, they can refer back to this note.
Yeah, and some of them, I mean, they wanted to work in the industry for even longer than I had, so it was very nice for them to have that opportunity and experience to come together as a team and to help make their own, they'll be able to go on and make their own things later on. But my job is not just to develop this project, my job is also to bring people together that can move forward. And I hope that we've built a little something, the little deaf empire in Hollywood where we can make things happen. I hope we've done that.
Oh, I think it's the start of it, most certainly.
I hope so.
We have you and a few other people are fighting hard to make sure that deaf people are represented well in Hollywood, and I know that's a major challenge because if you think about, the stage is set for spoken language and that to be the focus.
The hair I have is because of the entertainment industry. I'm only 36, look how much gray I've got.
Yeah, you still look handsome. For 36, don't worry about
Well,
that.
yeah, no, I try, thanks.
I'd like to hear you describe some of your experiences here, and one thing that I'd like to shift the focus here on next is just the emphasis that you've talked about having this immersive experience, and that's something I couldn't put into words when I first saw the film, but it is immersive. I think people do get brought into the storyline in a very different way than you might find otherwise, and it's truly the Gallaudet experience, that full immersion, so I want to thank you for creating that sense. So I want people to watch the next clip, and there's a little bit more that can...
And when I got into the van, they stepped on it. I didn't even have a chance to close the door. The TTY was in a glass cubicle. Like a mini fishbowl, and everyone's staring at me.
Great clip, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It's just that moment in time that's so significant. I don't know if people realize as they set the scene here and why that scene is so different because of the deaf point of view you bring into the creating of this piece, where you can actually gather together to see each other, and why that glass enclosure was so important. I wonder if you could describe that deaf point of view. I know you've already spoken to it a bit earlier, but just that immersive experience into the deaf community. This is a concrete example of what it means to be deaf with the TTY and everything else. Can you tell us a little bit about the making of the scene, what was involved, and why it's those experiences?
Yeah, so this was one of many conversations I had with Davis saying, look, I want a TTY in the movie. We have to have TTYs in the movie because they don't get shown in movies anymore at all. I mean, it really is, you couldn't not have that. That was the heart of the deaf experience, and I grew up using a TTY until 2000 and something. And so we were fortunate that Greg had mentioned this TTY scene, and we realized this was a scene we had to produce. We decided to play up the tension from the fire alarm poles and the communication with people on campus, that we needed deaf people out, and for Greg to come and be led to Old Gym, and how Old Gym was designed back then. They did have a glass cubicle. So we call it the deaf space, so people could see through the walls, sort of, and communicate and not be blocked by, the infrastructure. So I thought that how Greg talked about this scene, it was too good to be true, really. The scene was built on what he told us itself. So we decided to take the audience on a little bit of a ride, from Greg running from the dorm building and being able to get to the basement of Old Gym, to be able to have this phone call and the glass cubicle. Again, this film just wants to explore this 1 week in time, nothing before, nothing after. We're just focused on this one ride, from the moment where they appointed a hearing president of the university until...
It's almost as if you're there with everyone with the movement of the camera. Was that what you were trying to create with the technology?
Okay, so yeah, with those cameras, let me tell you.
It creates that feel.
So that is a reenactment. And Greg was a great storyteller for that, right? Just by nature, by a natural storyteller, so he told us the story. And it made shooting this scene much easier. So the use of the sound design even, and the visual design of the scene. It was
Two interesting observations I wanted to share with you. That glass enclosed area, I don't know why people would maybe be wondering why it was so important to have the glass, and I can imagine people saying, you know, hey, it's my turn, wrap up your phone call, and that's why it was important to have a glass room, right? That was the design of the old gym. Maybe you want to tell us we want to have a room that's enclosed in glass.
So it was a glass walls so people could see, because there would be people in there. I mean, it's just how we move through life, is making sure that communication is easier for us visually.
Funny because you actually wanted to show what it looked like to have that space, and Greg was describing the feeling of having everybody hovering over and looking through the wall, those walls being a barrier, but yet people being able to huddle around and see it. It really creates that feeling.
That is the way it happened. Greg knew that, you know, by visual and by feel, people were pounding on the glass. And so that's another thing from the deaf point of view that we wanted to play with. We don't always hear people pounding on the glass, but we could feel the vibrations and the movement that creates. And so many things Davis didn't think were going to work, but they
did. It's probably one of the most powerful clips. I wanted to ask you another question. People may not realize when he says this is Greg GA and type that on the TTY. You know, these days of texting, we don't use terms like GA anymore. We can see clearly when it's the next person's turn to type.
Yeah, we say deaf people invented all of the shortcuts we do on text today because of TTYs. Those old days, GA means go ahead. It means I'm done typing with what I'm going to say, and it's your turn to type. SK means stop keying, means that I'm saying goodbye. QQ was in the place of you. One of my favorite stories is Troy Kotzer, who was the lead in Coda and got an Academy Award for that. He had to leave the protest just 3 days later because his grandmother passed away in Arizona. So he was at the protest and had no way to communicate with his family in Arizona, but he wasn't sure if the protest was going to be successful or not, so he decided to fly home to Arizona, got to Phoenix, and the whole deaf community in Phoenix was holding their own protests in support of Deaf President Now, all because of a TTY message. The TTY was the way we communicated throughout the entire United States to tell everybody what was going on, you know, just a few years before the internet, and if it might have not been news to be able to get out.
So I wanted to repeat something that Phil Braven, who became the chair of the board after this, he mentioned that TTY moment. It's not here in the film, but I don't know if you still know this story. But, you know, anyone could be typing to you on the other end. You wouldn't know if the person was authentically Greg or whoever it was. So they created a way to do that. There was a code that they used, and I don't know if you want to share with the audience how you could identify if the person was authentically who they were.
Sure. Sometimes, you know, when you're on the phone and you're talking to somebody else as a hearing person, you can hear the person's voice, right? You know what they sound like. So you use sound. But how do deaf people validate who's on the other end of the phone? So we would use certain codes or something like that, or questions that we would ask. You know, who's your parents? What are your kids' names? Or different things that would be asked to ensure, you know, like between Phil and Greg, because their families had been friends for many years in New York. And so they knew that they could ask the names of each other's siblings to be able to share that with one another so they could verify who's on the other end of the phone.
We don't talk as much about the two of them and the role they played. As I watch this again, and every time I watch it, I notice something new. You know, Jerry was clearly the one who was out there advocating and the fighter of the group, but you also see Greg even appears to be more diplomatic, more of a statesman by nature. And, you know, every single time you can see the different roles and the personalities of each. Could you share a little bit more about Borgetta and Tim and how you saw their roles? What was important about their leadership as it related to this story moment is this.
So Tim, well, okay, so Jerry is a riot. He's a complete riot. He can rouse an audience like nobody. That's his strength. Greg, like you said, is very diplomatic. Tim, I call him the grassroots guy, where he just worked with the community to make things happen, mobilized the students. Jerry was rousing people up, but we needed somebody else who was, on the ground doing the work, and that was Tim. That was his role. Rogetta was to keep everybody together, really. There was a lot of, there's a moment in the film during the protest where Jerry was riling people up, but it wasn't coordinated. It wasn't working. And that's where Rogetta came in with her cheerleader background, getting everybody coordinated. That's one of my favorite parts of the movie. When you guys watch this, you'll see it, where she could just get everybody working together. And that's one of my favorite things is with the DPN for these student leaders, and 3 men, and Rogetta did was to jump in as a woman and say, you need a female leader as a part of this movement, and that's definitely one of her strengths. And at the time, Rogetta has even admitted that she had a lot of, she was upset a little bit, feeling a little conflicted because it was a woman who had been appointed, and she's a feminist, but Rogetta, as a feminist, wanted to support a woman as the president of the university. She admits it took her a few beats to realize that that deaf identity was the wheelhouse, and she says, it's so hard to speak over all this noise. It sure would be easier to communicate with you. So it's obvious that she still doesn't get it. And if she knew ASL, she could communicate. And that's one of my favorite moments. Just that proves that everything that she thought of us. Well, and ironically, there's no alarm going off right now. So when Greg says, I'm just going to be deaf, and he takes his hearing aid out of his ear. Such a powerful moment for me that it takes a long time, even for deaf people, to just decolonize their minds and to be able to understand it. Deaf people still have that even today, but that final moment of truth for Greg, where he just sheds kind of that last hearing parasite that's on his head and takes it off, and just accepts himself as a deaf person.
That you did this with us, with our collaboration, using the storage of knowledge and information and tapping into that to bring it to life. That's such valuable information in the archives, and I know that was due in part to your insistence on this.
Well, when Davis and really originally the plan was to be a scripted film, actually. It was to be, a scripted film. We wrote a script, 2 authors, a deaf and hearing author, and there was no weight to the script. Because again, Deaf President Now is not a simple story. And how do we go back? How do we show that historical context in a scripted film and the reasons why? So in talking with Davis, he said, look, let's make this a documentary instead of a scripted project, and we can co-direct this. And I said, well, the big question is, what do we have in the archives for documentary work? Because, every year at Gallaudet goes by and we celebrate the Deaf BN protest, but we don't see, except for the same 3 or 4 clips every time, every year. So I'm like, I don't know what exists. I don't know what Gallaudet has anymore. It's been so long. I don't know what they have in the archives. And if there's nothing in the archives, we can't make a film. So we asked Gallaudet, we asked you, and we crossed our fingers. And we said, look, we'll digitize this over 400 hours. Just by itself, we could make a film out of that. And so that gave us a lot more to play with. And so thank God you had everything. I still talk with my best friend who's deaf, who's like, they're shocked by how much was filmed at the time in 1988, how many photos were taken and stuff like that. In my phone, I take a lot of pictures and stuff like that, but they were doing that in 1988.
I think that's part of what is so important as it relates to this experience, is that there are so many people who were there to bear witness. They are bearing witness to this event, and there's so many who are taking film of it. There was one young boy who must have been 9 or 10 years old and went with his parents to the protest. And he had a camera, and he was filming as a young child, and it was stored in the archives. He wanted to create his own story for his class, and he sent me a video of the clips that he had made. And just, as an adult, he was sending me what he made as a 9-year-old boy that the archives was able to also tap into. And just reminding people here in the room that you are part of telling the story of today. And what gets stored and the way you put that into the right place for future usage is critical. You cannot underestimate the value of your films and pictures that you take, and the reliance on that as being history as we go forward. And storing it is so critical to make sure you store it in the right place so that people would be able to tap into that body of knowledge and share that story. That's what worries me so much as time goes by, is how can we continue to gather and create and archive those deaf stories. You've brought this to life for the world, and it's one of the most important gifts that you've been able to provide to the world. And on that note, how do you want people to experience this movie? I know that it's being shown globally on Apple Plus to over 100 countries. It's being translated into hundreds of languages and perhaps even more. With that, what do you want people around the world to take away from they've seen that?
To get past these little things and to continue to build that community, the power of the collective action that is shown in this film is very...
And that, Nyle, you wanted to make this movie and people knew that you did. And what I heard, or what I saw rather, was that you went to Concordia Films and made a request that they could produce this. And Davis, you said it had to be Davis or no one else?
No.
You did not ask for Davis to work with you?
No. Okay, so I pitched the idea to one of the producers, Jonathan King, at Concordia. So yeah, he works at Concordia Studios. And he hadn't heard the story, he loved it, wanted to partner up. But then when we were struggling to sell the scripted version, I met with Davis. And Davis and Jonathan, they are co-owners of the studio, the production company. And Davis was like, well, let's make a documentary of this. This needs to be made. This needs to be a documentary. And we should direct this together. And so that's how it came.
Partnership between
Yes.
both of you. Jonathan King has been with you this entire time
Yes.
about the creation of the documentary, and I know you've worked with him.
He has never wavered. A lot of ideas in Hollywood die. They don't move quickly, so if things don't get sold in a couple of years, they just move on to the next project. But Jonathan, he stuck with us for 6 years saying, no, this is an important story, we've got to make it. We're going to find a way, one way or another. I kept doubting, asking.
Cutting out the audio for them, those decisions in the film, the times when you cut the audio.
So that's a good question. So one of the things I talked with my co-director about was having sound design, but I don't know how to do it myself. So one of the ideas that I had was, during this Spillman moment, in the gym with the fire alarms going off and everything, for us to cut to from Spillman's perspective and the loud environment, and then shift over to the student perspective where everything was quiet. If you've seen the movie and remember that scene, I told Davis, I said, I don't know how we do this, but we need to do something, so we need to change the volume or something like that. But Davis' idea was, I don't know how to explain it because, being deaf, but to mute the sound in a very specific way to help the hearing people understand that we've changed perspective. So it's a very abrupt perspective change there. I don't know, I have to trust him on that and honor the system that he did. And
The world and all that you've done, showing the best of what we can be, especially when it comes to what we do here, what Gallaudet Diploma can create. I'm so proud of you being able to take Gallaudet out into the world. We can't take all the credit, a lot more came to that and built it in who you are, but you are a role model for the world, showing what deaf people can do.
Well, thank you for letting us tell this story, and thank you everyone for coming this afternoon.
Thanks to Apple and the Carnegie Library, Apple Plus for the event.